All right, good evening. This is the last Wednesday of the quarter. Sunday was our last Sunday of the quarter. November has just evaporated. It's already almost over, and December will be here Saturday, right? Yes, Saturday is the 1st. So, we are wrapping it up. Somebody had said something recently to me that I thought about, that sometimes when parents are dropping off children in classes and stuff, and they try to rush back up because they don't want to miss anything in class, and I thought, well, it'd probably be good to sort of buy a few minutes, I suppose, to let those parents who are dropping off children get back. However, not tonight, because I've got so much that you know what, we just better jump right in. There's almost zero chance that I'm going to make it through what I need to cover tonight, but we'll do the best we can. This is the last night, so I had to even already spent just a lot of time picking and choosing. What am I going to leave out? What am I going to put in? With the understanding that I knew I wouldn't finish it all. So hopefully we can cover most of this. That sometimes happens in a class where you get to a point where you don't really have enough to go another quarter, but you got too much to finish up in that one night. So anyway, be that as it may, let's just pick right up where we left off last week. We began, actually I don't think we did, we finished up talking about crucifixion. And I told you that in our next class we'd begin talking about village life, city life. Obviously, some differences between shepherding life out in the fields, and shepherding life sometimes crosses over, because sometimes you might have some shepherds that they would live within the city walls or right around them, but they had flocks, and so they would have flocks that might stay, and they might have sheepfolds right there near the city. They wouldn't be in the city walls, obviously, but there might be a cave just outside the city or something like that, and so sometimes they would be out for an extended period of time with the sheep or with the herds, flocks, herds, things like that. But typically you're going to see differences between the nomadic life and life within the city. Obviously you see both talked about in the Bible. As towns and villages became cities, the first thing they've got to have is water. You can't have a city if you don't have access to water. Sometimes, though, you get farther and farther away from springs, and so you find yourself needing water. Sometimes you could use wells, but wells could be limited in supply, and groundwater was sometimes bad. There were certain places where you didn't want to use the groundwater as far as digging a well. I remember growing up, we had well water, and if you use too much of it, you got to let it build back up. And sometimes, if you wanted to upset my dad, let that well run dry. I remember those were some hot fits that he threw sometimes when the water got run out, and usually it was because of one of us kids. You use too much. If you may be washing the car, it may be. One time we had a little small pool, and the pool got too low, and so as a kid you'd think, pool's low, go run some water from the hose. You run that well dry, you're in trouble. So sometimes you couldn't use, the well water was limited. Sometimes the groundwater wasn't great, so they would dig these slow-flowing water channels. And of course, what ended up being famous? The aqueducts. Romans kind of made those famous. Just like crucifixion, Romans didn't invent the aqueducts. They sort of perfected it. They kind of made it famous. But they were actually not the inventors of them. Jerusalem has one particular rock-cut aqueduct dating to around 700 BC. It flows 1,850 feet and drops only 3 feet the entire distance. And so the water just, it's not gonna, it's not like tipping a bucket upside down. That you get a good steady flow. There are 2 aqueducts in that area that one was made by Herod, one was made by Pontius Pilate. They brought water over 15 miles to Jerusalem from the higher springs in the south. And then, of course, there's a model at the Biblical History Center. It's a replica of an aqueduct that is actually, it's a replica, but it's a replica of one that actually has been discovered in Galilee that flows 90 feet and drops only 2 inches. The replica does. Let me clarify that. The replica flows, it's about 90 feet long. Some of you have been to the Biblical History Center and you've seen that. You may be like me. I had seen it, but I did not know that, I had not seen the dimensions as far as being 90 feet long and only dropping 2 inches. But it's a good example of just letting gravity help you transport the water. There's a portion of that replica that you find at the Biblical History Center. And you can see here, it comes out over here. The water comes and will turn this wheel, and there's a grinding wheel in there, and we'll see that picture in just a moment. Oh, well, it's next. So it turns this wheel, the big wheel, which turns this, and you can see the gears, and it's turning a millstone. So you could have that in some cities where it would turn, and you could go there and you could grind meal, grind grain, things like that. So used for different purposes. Here's a still standing Roman aqueduct. One of the things that the Roman aqueducts are famous for is their durability. They're all over Europe. You can find them in many places still standing. It's pretty amazing. They used just some amazing, they accomplished rather some amazing feats of engineering. Very quickly, just mention one other thing about the aqueducts that's just mind-boggling to me is that the Romans knew how to use sealed sections of stone pipe. They would most often use tar to seal it, and they could transport water up one side and down the other of a valley to bring water to a town. And depending on the elevation of the drop and the rise, water pressure could really build up in the pipes, and of course sometimes the stone cracked and needed replacement. Many of these siphon aqueducts were designed with places to vent air so they could recreate the siphon after repairs. But again, pretty amazing stuff when you consider what we would often, we talk about ancient civilization. We would think of them not having a whole lot of technology, but they were pretty savvy in accomplishing things. One of the main interests of a famous ancient Greek mathematician and engineer, Archimedes, was one of his main interests was transporting water. And he is perhaps most famous for the Archimedean screw, a device that transported water uphill. Pretty amazing stuff. He also designed water wheels for grinding grain, cutting rocks, and other tasks. So he was very interested in working with water and especially transporting water. So pretty neat stuff. Here's a better look at that water coming into this big wheel that turns it. Of course, the water, kind of a little small version of a trough here, several of these, and of course the weight of that eventually turns the wheel, and then it comes here and turns the smaller and powers that grinding stone. Going a little bit more in depth, a little bit more generalities here with the city. There were several things that you would find when you look at kind of typical ancient city plans. There would be a high spot, which would kind of be a military command center. Obviously, you want the high ground. You can see enemies coming. It gives you an advantage in defense and in battle. There's a windy side of the city where the wind tends to blow. Who do you reckon lives in a very hot climate on the windy side of the city? The top dogs, the wealthy. That's where they live because that's the expensive real estate. You get the breezes up there. It's cooler. So if you live on the cooler side of the city, you're going to have to pay for it. So then you got outside the city walls. Reckon who lives outside the city walls? The very poor folks, because they can't afford to be within the city. And what's the advantage of being inside the city? Protection. The first people to go down if an invading force comes through are the ones that are just outside with very little to no protection. So the poor people obviously end up living outside the city walls. You got to have a water source area. This would usually be some kind of city cistern near a water tunnel, aqueduct, whatever it might be in that circumstance. We'll talk in a moment, toward the end, hopefully we get there, about cisterns that will be put in cities to collect rainwater many times. And then, of course, the easiest access side is where they put the city gate, typically where the road comes by there or, something like that, just the easiest access. That's where you put the city gate. And of course, you have a city gate courtyard, which will be the best place for assembly, people gathering. And we'll talk about that in our next few slides here. The courtyard. This is a large, open, we say paved area. Some cities, obviously, it might just be dirt. But a clearing, we'll say. A large, open area that would be just inside the city gate. The gate, again, is the most likely place of an enemy attack, so the courtyard is there, in part at least, to have a place where your defenders can assemble. Somebody may be kind of giving orders, okay, you're going to go here, you take up the high ground. It might be bows and arrows, it might be rocks, slings, they would sometimes use spears, javelins, sometimes King James calls a spear a javelin. But you could kind of prepare for a defense. And so you can gather everybody there, and also you could have a force of infantry right there. Overnight visitors to the city, they might need a place to stay. You're traveling, you don't want to just stay out in the open. And so you could go, and often you could stay within the city square. What is this? Does anybody think of a situation in the Bible where we read about something like this? There, in fact, that's the location. There was the city I'm thinking of. Now that's one also, Bob, that you're thinking of. The one I'm thinking of was a city that was so bad that a resident of the city comes along and says, "Don't stay in the city square. Come home with me." Sodom. Genesis chapter 19. I didn't put the reference. I guess I just forgot to put the reference. But Sodom. These visitors come. Of course, we find out later they're angels taking on a human form. But Lot comes and says, "Hey, I'm begging you, don't stay here in the courtyard." He understood the people there were very wicked. And so he takes them home to stay at his house. And, of course, then the men of the city beset him round about. And they try to basically force Lot to turn over those guests. So the courtyard offered a place to give visitors hospitality, ostensibly. Now, again, you had places like Sodom. I think Gibeah. You mentioned Gibeah, Bob, but it's in the book of Judges, and I think Gibeah is the location where that happened. Where there's a man in the time period of the Judges, and he's traveling with his concubine, or he went to get his concubine who had left him. And same thing, he's out in the town square. These people come along. This one fellow says, "Don't stay out here." And of course, basically a very similar situation to Genesis 19. But it offered a place to again, supposedly the idea is to offer hospitality to your guests, to visitors who might be passing through. But it's also a place where you can let them stay, and if they're suspicious, you can kind of keep an eye on them. You sort of keep them under watchful eye. There's a lot of stuff going on in the town square, and so you say, you stay here, and that way, there's constantly, other than just the dead of night when everybody's asleep, you can keep an eye on people. Being close to the gate, the courtyard is a natural place for governors, military commanders, and perhaps even the king at times to address the townsfolk. We see an example of this. Let's go to 2 Samuel. We haven't quite got this far in our Sunday morning class, but we're not terribly far away from it. After the rebellion of Absalom, Joab has some pretty strong and stern words for David, telling him, you need to address the people and stop moping, is essentially what he tells David. You're moping around. I think you'd have been happier if Absalom had lived and all of your soldiers had died. And he says, you got two choices. You can go speak comfortably to thy servants. This is 2 Samuel 19. I don't know if I gave you a chapter there, sorry. Verse 7, he says, he essentially says, you got two choices. Go speak comfortably to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if thou go not forth, there will not tarry one with thee this night. And that will be worse unto thee than all the evil that befell thee from thy youth until now. And Joab has some pretty strong words for David here, but I tell you what, Joab wasn't always an honorable and good man, but I think he had it. I think he pretty well hit the nail on the head with this one. David is moping around about Absalom, and of course, understandably in one sense, because that's his son. So basically, David arises, verse 8, and he sat in the gate. And they told unto all the people, saying, Behold, the king doth sit in the gate. And all the people came before the king, for Israel had fled every man to his tent. This would be in the courtyard, the gate area, courtyard area. And so David speaks there to address the people and kind of settle everybody after this rebellion of Absalom. There's another instance in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. I'll just go ahead and read that one quickly. All the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street, and I think it's the New King James. Anybody got a New King James? Look at Nehemiah 8:1. I'm going to pull it up real quick, but you may beat me there. I think it actually says the town square. Say again? Open square. All the people gathered together as one man in the open square that was in front of the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded Israel. So he did. Verse 3, then he read from it in the open square that was in front of the water gate from morning until midday. You drop down to verse 16. Same chapter. Then the people went out and brought them and made themselves booths, each one on the roof of his house, or in their courtyards, or the courts of the house of God, and in the open square of the water gate, and in the open square of the gate of Ephraim. So some of the people had these tabernacles to celebrate the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. Some of them had them on top of their house. Again, remembering these are flat roofs. That's part of what I cut out. We didn't have as much time to talk about the flat roofs. There might be a quick reference to it. Some of them had these booths on top of their house. Some of them had them out in the open square, which would probably be some of the people who were outside the city walls, coming within the city walls to celebrate that feast with the others. The city gate, this kind of goes right with the town square or the courtyard. The city gate's located at the lowest, most vulnerable location. Again, that's why they would put the courtyard just inside to help defend it. The gates are typically closed at night. Why is that? It's just safety. Same reason we close and lock our doors at night, right? There's some couple of references I want to look at. If you're still in Nehemiah, go over to Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah has he's gone home to Jerusalem. He's returned back to the king. Now he's come back again in chapter 13. And it's in verse 15, he sees some people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They're bringing in sheaves. They're bringing in stuff to sell, basically, is what he's saying. And so they're coming in to try to conduct business on the Sabbath day. And these are some men of Tyre that are bringing fish and all manner of ware, and they're selling to the children of Judah and Jerusalem. And, they said, we're Gentiles. We don't keep the Sabbath. But it was kind of laying a stumbling block before the Israelites. So Nehemiah says, I contended with the nobles of Judah, said unto them, what evil thing is this that you do, and profane the Sabbath day? He says, didn't your fathers do this? It's part of why we ended up in captivity, for not keeping the Sabbath. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates that there should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath day. He says, we're going to close the gates. They're staying shut all through the Sabbath. And when the Sabbath is over, fully over, then we'll open the gates and you can worry about your business. But they were so obsessed with making money and conducting business, they weren't honoring the Sabbath that God had commanded them to keep under that covenant. It's interesting, there's another passage that kind of goes, it doesn't necessarily go with this, but it's this idea of the gates. What is Revelation 21 talking about in this context? It's talking about heaven. You've got 12 gates according to verse 21. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. but there's no temple therein, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. Verse 23 says there's no need of the sun, neither of the moon, for the glory of God did lighten it. But there's also one other thing that they don't need, and that is to close the gates. The gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, verse 25, for there shall be no night there. And what that's telling us is you don't have to worry about your safety in eternity. Now, there's no need to close the gates. Now, are there gates in heaven? No, it's a spiritual place. There are no physical gates. What he's saying is you're secure. God's going to look after you. You don't need the sun. You don't need the moon. You don't need the temple, that physical representation of God's presence among them. And you don't need to worry about locking your doors. You're secure. You're safe. Gates were also places where the notables could address the people concerning important matters. We saw that in 2 Samuel 19 already. There's a reference in the book of Ruth. Boaz, when he realizes that Ruth is his kinfolk, he wants to redeem her, but he says to her, there's actually a closer kinsman than I am. And she goes home, Ruth does, and Naomi tells her, to just hold tight, because she knew that Boaz was smitten by her. And she said, he's not gonna rest until he takes care of this, is essentially what Naomi tells Ruth. Boaz goes immediately, and where does he go? To the city gate. And he finds this other kinsman, this closer kinsman, and he says, hey, we got to talk. Let's sit down and talk business. And so he ends up, of course, redeeming Ruth, because the other fellow says, I can't redeem this. I would mar my own inheritance. But that all happens there in the gate, and the judges are there to kind of preside over that and make sure everything's on the up and up. Absalom. There's an interesting case with Absalom. If you want to look at 2 Samuel, I'm just stepping all over my Sunday morning class tonight, but that's okay. Yeah, we'll just jump to 2 Samuel 20 this coming Sunday morning. 2 Samuel 15 this time. If I can find it. Absalom rose up early, verse 2 says, and he stood beside the way of the gate. So he's standing there in the gate, and it was so that when any man had a controversy, came to the king for judgment, Absalom called unto him and said, hey, come over here. What city are you from? Tell me where you're from. And he'd say, thy servant's one of the tribes of Israel. And so Absalom would say to him something, to the effect of, look, you got a good point here. I mean, you're right. You're not getting done right here. But there's no man. King David, he doesn't have anybody that's going to look after you. He doesn't have anybody that's going to take care of your needs. And he would say, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. Look, man, you're right. You need somebody to stand up for you. You need the king to step in, but they're just, David, he just doesn't have anybody to do that. Now, if it were up to me, I'd step in and I'd defend your rights. I'd stand up for you. Well, that's easy to say when you're not the king, isn't it? It's easy to say when you're not in charge. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. He's kissing the babies. He's a politician. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. It's part of how he set up his rebellion. It ended up not being successful, but it was as successful as it was because he went to the gate. People are coming and going in the gate all the time, and they've got matters to take before the king, to take before the judges, to take before the government. And Absalom's sitting there every time they go away, and maybe the governor or the judge or whomever, whatever you want to call that position, maybe they say, look, man, I wish I could help you, but if I helped everybody, the nation will be completely broke. And maybe the guy's going, yeah, well, I kind of understand that. And then about that time he turns around and Absalom says, come here. Man, that's not right. And you can just hear it, that type of behavior. But that was all taking place right there in the gate. There's another interesting case, Second Kings, chapter 23. One of the best kings that Judah had ever known was King Josiah. Old Josiah he starts a revival, and his revival extends even into what used to be the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom's in captivity. There is no northern kingdom at this time. But he even goes up in there, and he's destroying groves of idols and idolatrous altars and things like that. But he's breaking down houses of the Sodomites, verse 7 tells us, that were by the house of the Lord. But look at verse 8, right? Yes, verse 8. And he brought all the priests out of the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba, and brake down the high places of the gates that were in the entering in of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on a man's left hand at the gate of the city. They built these idolatrous places at the gate. Josiah goes to the gate, and he wrecks them. He destroys them. And he says, essentially, I'm putting all of you idolaters on notice that this is not how we're going to run things under the reign of Josiah. We're going to worship and we're going to serve Jehovah. And he goes to the gate, and he does this because people would take notice of what's done in the city gate. Gates also, by the way, served as sort of an ancient water cooler, for lack of a better term, where people just gathered and talked, and no doubt sometimes gossiped. There's an interesting passage in Proverbs. What is Proverbs 31 about? Probably recognize the reference. The virtuous woman, right? But one of the things that we're told is with her and her husband, look at verse 23. That's not right. Yeah, it is, 23. Looking at the wrong chapter. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. What's that saying? Behind every good man is a good woman. And a surprised mother-in-law, that's right. But her husband is known in the gates because he's sitting among the elders of the people. He's influential, but in large part because he has such a good woman who supports him and helps him in every way. And of course, verse 31, give her of the fruit of her hands and let her own works praise her in the gates. And so the city gates. Also, here we go. The gate was intended to be a symbol of justice. Let me get some volunteers so we can expedite these next few verses. Who wants Psalm 118, verse 19? I'm just going to start calling names if nobody volunteers. Okay. All right, so Bob, you got Psalm 118, 19. Chris said you got Proverbs 8, 1 through 3. Brother Martin, Proverbs 14, 19. Billy, I saw your hand up, didn't I? Amos 5:15. Who else? Jacob, Zechariah 8:16. And then somebody else had a hand up. Tim, Psalm 24, 7 through 9. And one more. Caleb, Jeremiah 8, 19 through 22. And if you read your verse and it doesn't sound like anything about gates, just hang on. I went a little further with some of those references just to expedite it here. Psalm 118, verse 19, Brother Bob.
Open to me the gates of righteousness. I will enter into them. I will give thanks unto Jehovah.
Entering into the gates of righteousness. The idea of gates symbolizing justice, doing what's right in the sight of the Lord. Proverbs 8, 1 through 3.
Does not wisdom cry out, and understanding lift up her voice? She takes her stand on the top of a high hill, beside the way where the paths meet. She cries out by the gates, at the entry of the city, at the entrance of the doors.
Wisdom's crying out to you at the very gate of the city. You can't come in the city without hearing wisdom cry. Are you going to answer? Are you going to follow wisdom? Or are you just going to ignore, like the foolish man that is described so many times in the book of Proverbs? Proverbs 14, 19. I don't remember who had that one. The wicked will bow at the gates of the righteous. Gates symbolizing the justice there. Amos 5:15. A very wicked nation, he says, hate evil, love good, establish justice in the gates, and maybe God will show some mercy, because they were right there at the very cusp of they're going to be utterly wiped out, going into captivity. Zechariah 8:16. So often the judgment was perverted. People were not judging justly, righteously. They were judging in favor of the rich, friends, things like that. So they were supposed to symbolize justice. And then there's another reference here that I think Tim's got it right, Psalm 24, 7 through 9.
Lift up your head, O ye gates, and be lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your head, O ye gates, even lift them up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in.
I've never seen a gate that looked anything like a human head. Have you? But to the Hebrews, these terminology, these metaphors and similes that they use, they're related to functionality. That's why when you read in Song of Solomon, the description, there's actually a very funny picture in the book that I got from the Biblical History Center. I meant to take a picture of it and put it in here just to show you. Some artist drew a rendition. If you took every description of Solomon's love in that chapter, literally, here's what the person would look like, and it's rather ridiculous. But it's meant to describe functionality. Eyes like doves, purity, and so there are different functionalities. So lift up your heads, gates. It's not that gates resemble in any way, shape, form, or fashion physically heads, but it's the idea of the heads of the judges, the heads of the king, or the head of the king. Lift up your head in righteous judgment. Do what is right. Follow God. And that's the idea. It's toward the functionality. Daughters of the city or daughters of the town. That would reference the poor outside the city walls. Who had Jeremiah 8? Caleb, you got that? 19 through 22? All right, so he talks about the daughter of his people. Those are the poor who live outside the city walls. Sometimes you'll see reference to the daughters of Jerusalem, the daughters of Israel. It's a reference to people living outside the city walls, typically. Some references I looked at and I thought, I'm not so sure about that. But at least more often than not, it's fair to say it is. You see this a lot in Scripture. In fact, where was Jesus crucified? Inside the city or out? Outside the city. And he passed by some people who were weeping, and he said what? In Luke 23, weep not for me, ye daughters of Jerusalem. So the idea there, in fact, these daughters of the cities quite often got neglected. Here comes an enemy, close up shop, especially if there's going to be a siege, because that's just more mouths to feed, right? And so sometimes the poor of the land would wonder, is there ever going to come a king who's going to be fair and take care of us just like you take care of the wealthy people inside the city? And of course, Jesus is that King of Kings. But the daughters often refers to those who are too poor to afford to live within the city walls. Another aspect of city life is the water cistern and collection system. I don't know what I did there. But anyways, you can see this. The cisterns were sometimes dug to contain precious rainwater runoff. They would dig these cisterns to collect rainwater. And especially, you would have a slab of stone that would cover the opening, and you've got a period of around May to September is dry season. And so you'd cover that, so you try to keep it as, keep light out as much as possible to keep the water as fresh as long as possible. Water would collect from various places. They would funnel it from all over the city to the cistern. And in fact, of course, as you see there in the third little sub point, there's often a water pipe that would go under the road, and you'd have another cistern. So you got a cistern on one side of the gate, a cistern on the other side of the gate, or on one side of the road and the other side of the road, and they're both collecting water, and they tried to let as little rainwater escape the city as possible. You can ill afford to let it go to waste, knowing that the dry season is coming. Jeremiah talks about his people, and they preferred to serve idols instead of Jehovah. And it's interesting because if you want to look at Jeremiah 2, it's one of my favorite verses in Jeremiah. Caleb read from Jeremiah 8. Brother Richard Curry taught Jeremiah at Memphis School of Preaching for years, and my class was one of the last classes he was able to teach. And you could say, Brother Curry, do you have a favorite verse in Jeremiah? And he would always say, is there no balm in Gilead? I can just hear his deep voice. He loved Jeremiah 8:22. One of my favorites is Jeremiah 2:13. He says, my people have committed two evils. Number one, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Now, what does that mean? See if you remember from our earlier class. What's living water? Ultimately, it's going to reference Jesus. But to a Hebrew person, what is living water? Two ways of describing water, living water and sea. What's the difference? It's moving water. Sea is gathered water. Living water was a reference, and still is among Jewish people, a reference to moving water, like a spring. So you got a choice. You can go get water in a cistern that's probably a pretty good chance it's going to be at least a little bit stagnant, or you can have spring water. What are you going to choose? Well, God's people didn't. They're drinking from a cistern, but it's not even just a cistern. It's a broken cistern that can hold no water. You just go and you're digging around in the muck and the mire of this slimy cistern trying to grab a drink when all along you got living water. Jeremiah says, how foolish can they be? The Rabshakeh in 2 Kings 18, he's talking to the people there, and he says, hey, look, don't listen to King Hezekiah. Don't try to resist Assyria. You do what I say, and good old King Sennacherib, he's going to take you away to a land, and you can have water out of your own cistern. Now, again, common sense. Would you rather drink from a community cistern? You know, here comes a little boy, and, you know, first thing you know, he's, he's coughing into it, or he's sneezing into it. Or you want a community cistern, or you want your own? Well, duh. He said, follow me. Sennacherib's going to take you to a land. You'll have your own cistern. And he was lying. But that's what he was telling the people. That's what he was promising them. The wise man used drinking water from your own cistern as a metaphor for marital fidelity. Proverbs 5:15. He says, don't be going trying to get water from another man's cistern. You be satisfied with your wife. And you drink waters from your own cistern. Interesting metaphor there for faithfulness in marriage. Here is a massive cistern. This is a picture from Masada. It's a massive cistern built by Herod the Great. You can actually see, I don't know if you can see it that well. Oh yeah, it's much better back here. You can see some water lines where it's actually held water. There's steps over here. Now obviously that rail was installed later. But the steps actually were built with the cistern so they could get down in there and clean it if they needed to. But there's a passage in Jeremiah 38. I'm still there. I'm just going to turn over to Jeremiah 38. Somebody grab Zechariah 9:11 for me, if you would, please. My pages are sticking together something awful tonight. Jeremiah 38, it tells us Shephatiah the son of Mattan, and Gedaliah the son of Pashur, Jucal the son of Shelemiah, Pashur the son of Malchiah heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto all the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, he that remaineth in this city shall die by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence. But he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live, for he shall have his life for a prey, and shall live. That's what Jeremiah had been telling the people. You want to live, you go out and you surrender. God has decreed this city is going to fall. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. So if you want to live, you go out and surrender and take your lumps, as we would say. But, and they quote him again, This city shall surely be given into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, which shall take it. So then they say to the king in verse 4, We beseech thee, let this man be put to death, for thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. They say, look, he's discouraging everybody. They want to quit. Well, they should have. That was the word from Jehovah. Surrender. Zedekiah says, look, he's in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. Zedekiah was sort of a pansy. He just says, well, what am I going to do about it? You guys just do whatever. And so they took Jeremiah and they cast him in. The King James has dungeon, and most versions have dungeon. Look, Malchiah, the son of Hamelech, he doesn't have a dungeon in his house. This is some kind of a cistern that's in the court, and it would be kind of in the courtyard, probably the idea here. It says in the court of the prison. And they let down Jeremiah with cords. And in the dungeon, the cistern, there was no water but mire. All the, dirt and stuff collects, and especially when you're collecting, rain, runoff, and things like that, it begins to collect, and you end up with a bunch of sludge and mire, and Jeremiah gets down in that, and don't you know that smelled great? And he just sinks down in the mud. And he would have probably died there. That was no doubt their intention, but for Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, who comes and rescues him. Zechariah 9:11, who's got that?
As for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit.
So waterless pit, a cistern that's gone empty. It may have gone empty because it has a leak, like a broken cistern that Jeremiah talked about. It may have gone empty because they just used up the water, and maybe it's getting toward the end of that dry season, and they've run out. But anyway, you get the idea. But that's pretty interesting. Jeremiah would have been thrown into one of these types of cisterns, but that's an actual one there at Masada. There's a different view where you can see the steps that they built down into the cistern where they could clean or, I guess, repair whatever they might need to do. But that's a pretty massive cistern. As we kind of wrap up here, we may not get all the way done, but we're going to get pretty close. These are some random pictures from the Biblical History Center of the city section. This is from David Padfield's website. This is kind of a house, a typical Jewish 4-bedroom house, or 4-room house, not 4-bedroom, 4-room house. You can see again the flat roof. But it's also kind of combined with one structure to be also the gate / watchtower / seat of judgment. So it's kind of all together. So you just get a little 3 or 4 things in one display there. But that's one picture. Here's a look at the city gate there. You can see this kind of a replica of a city gate. Soldiers could stand up here, keep watch, and of course you can use these slits for shooting an arrow or something like that. Here's a type of like a seat of judgment. I don't know that every time in the Bible when you read about a judgment seat or a seat of judgment that it's talking about something exactly like this, but this was pretty common in ancient cities where you would have the king himself might sit in judgment. Probably pretty rare for the king himself to sit there, but a lot of times you'd have a judge or some type of designated official, and you would bring matters before him to be heard and judged. That's a look up. Over here is the judgment seat. So that's just directly above it. Leviticus 19:35 and 36. Somebody grab that, please. I'll get the Proverbs reference, if you will. Proverbs 16:11 says, "A just weight and balance are the Lord's. All the weights of the bag are His work." So here you see something that'd be common in a city, just right within the courtyard. You've got merchants, and they've got their weights, and so you can trade and barter and things like that. But sometimes they'd falsify these weights, wouldn't they? Leviticus 19, 35 and 36. Who's got it?
You shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, neither or keep your wait on just balance, just wait, and just peace, and just and a just king shall you have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt.
He says, be fair in your business. Don't cheat people. Don't try to rig your weight so you're making more money. Be fair in your business. And so that's something similar to what you might see in a city, ancient city. I didn't get a real good picture on one of my trips. They've got it set up where you can actually go up on top of the roof here and see. And I just didn't get pictures. But Joshua 2:6, Rahab is drying stalks of flax on the roof. That was common. Take them up on the roof, let them dry. David is out on the roof there, 2 Samuel 11. We'll talk about that this coming Sunday, Lord willing. The woman that her and her husband built a room for Elijah, 2 Kings 4. They put it on the roof. They put it on the city wall, which will probably be on the roof. Here's just some pictures of the house. You see different little compartments of the house. You see here you got a cooking fire. This is kind of the kitchen. And you can set food right through here through that little window. You can put your wood here. It goes to the outside. Like a bed here. Storage for some nuts and fruits. Another sleeping area. And you see there's not a lot of privacy in these ancient homes. That's typically how they did. In fact, on one occasion Jesus talked about a man who said, don't trouble me, I'm in bed with my children. They're all just together. Sometimes you're just crammed in, especially if you had company from out of town or something like that. You even had some 2 or 3 mangers where you could keep animals if you needed to in the house for a short period of time. If I can get. Hey, who said we weren't going to make it? We did it. Got to be some kind of record, right? Thank you very much. We'll begin a new study, good Lord willing, next Wednesday night. Thank you.